And that's it for the workings of the Boolean operators in the Fitch deductive system. Now, disjunction elimination, following the kind of reasoning we use in proof by cases, involves subproofs. And later on we'll even see subproofs within subproofs. Just to discuss some general rules for subproofs, I want to return to this proof that we went over in the last round. So suppose that we wanted to derive Q. I'm going to just erase the bottom of this and construct a proof in which something goes very wrong. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in a mistake here where you see something on an earlier line, like right here, and you say, oh, that's exactly what I want. So I'll just do line 7, reiterating line 7, and then put it down here, and that was my goal. The problem is that this line here is an assumption. It's not something that we've actually proved. We're saying, supposing this holds, what else holds further down? And so we're not entitled at all on line 11 to reach back into this subproof and pull out something that was merely being assumed for the sake of the argument. Here's a somewhat simpler example of something going wrong. Suppose we have P and Q, or R. Well, we're fine to assume R and derive R or Q. We're fine to assume P and Q, derive Q, and then derive R or Q. We saw a similar proof earlier on. But then suppose, I'm going to number these for clarity, we took this as a proof that Q, reiterating line 5, this is not allowed because we're reaching back into an assumption. Now, we're allowed to use things that we prove in the course of a subproof, but only within that subproof or within a sub-subproof or a sub-sub-subproof. We're not allowed to use these in our main proof unless they're derived at the end of the subproof in one of the ways we're permitted to do, like proof by cases. So we're not allowed to just reach back into subproofs and pluck things out as we please. The basic idea is that a subproof operates on an assumption, and just because we've proved something on an assumption doesn't mean we've proved that thing in absolute terms. And so this is what goes wrong when we take Q here out of the subproof. So why are we allowed to derive something like R or Q by or elim from lines 1, 2 to 3, and 4 to 6? Well, because at this point here, when we derive this and we go down to make use of this rule, which is okay, we've discharged the assumption, closed off the subproof, and in the approved way, using this rule that we're allowed to use, we've gotten what we wanted to prove. But again, that's going by cases, and that's an approved way of doing this, as you can see why. There's good philosophical motivation for wanting to be able to prove things by cases. But just by assuming something and then seeing that something else follows from it, we're not entitled to declare that the thing that follows is just true. For example, supposing that some of the premises that go into the plot of Jurassic Park were true, I might be in grave danger of being eaten after leaving the university today. And that allows us to say, okay, Jurassic Park conditions entail that I could be eaten. But that doesn't entail that I'm at risk of being eaten in the actual state of affairs, because it only follows from an assumption. It doesn't follow from anything we've actually stated. Here's an even more basic example. Suppose that we introduce an assumption not P in the course of an indirect proof, and we show that Q. This does not mean that we're entitled to derive Q. For example, suppose that Shakespeare didn't write Hamlet. Let's have this be our not P on our line here. Well, then it follows that someone else did. But that doesn't mean that someone else did. We were just assuming it in the first place. And that allowed us to get this conclusion, which falls out of our assumption, but which we haven't proved because we're just going on an assumption. So in all these cases, the proof fails. And the reason it fails is because in all these proofs, a conclusion is derived in a way that's not warranted by reaching back into a subproof and plucking something out that was only proved on the basis of an assumption. This is something to be really careful about because it can happen, and when it does, it's extremely bad. Ordinarily, Fitch won't allow you to make these kinds of mistakes because it'll block you from deriving lines that are contained in the subproofs. But the most important thing is to grasp why it is that this is not permitted.